We got married yesterday. Only special people were invited, my daughter-in-law said, with a smile that didn't quite reach her eyes. I remember the way the room seemed to shrink around me when she said it, like the air had quietly stepped back and left me standing there alone. I had been holding a small white gift box in my hands, something I'd spent 3 weeks picking out, wrapping carefully with silver ribbon, imagining the look on my son's face when I would hand it to him on his wedding day. A day I had pictured for years. A day I thought I would be part of. I stood there for a moment longer than I should have, just long enough to notice that my son, Daniel, didn't say a word. He didn't correct her. He didn't even look surprised. He just stood beside her, quiet, as if this had all been decided long before I ever opened my mouth to ask. I nodded slowly, as if I understood, even though I didn't. Yesterday, I repeated, my voice softer than I expected. Vanessa gave a small shrug, casual, almost bored. It was a small ceremony. Very intimate. We didn't want to make a big deal out of it. Only special people. The words echoed in my head, louder than anything else she had said. I felt my fingers tighten slightly around the gift box, the ribbon pressing into my palm. I'd always believed that weddings were about family, about bringing people together, about honoring the years that led up to that moment. I had imagined sitting in the front row, maybe dabbing my eyes with a tissue as Daniel said his vows, remembering the little boy who used to run into my arms after school, who once told me I was his whole world. I didn't say any of that. I didn't ask why I hadn't been invited. I didn't ask who had been considered special enough. Instead, I smiled. It wasn't a big smile, just enough to hold my dignity in place. That's wonderful, I said quietly, even as something inside me shifted, something small but permanent, like a door closing in a house I had lived in my entire life. I set the gift box down on the table beside me, smoothing the edge of the ribbon as if it mattered. Vanessa was already talking about something else, something trivial, and Daniel nodded along, his attention fully on her. I realized then that I was no longer part of the conversation. Maybe I hadn't been for a while. I stayed for another minute or two, long enough to prove to myself that I could. Then I picked up my purse, adjusted the strap on my shoulder, and walked toward the door. No one stopped me. No one asked where I was going. The hallway felt quieter than usual, the soft hum of the house almost distant. When I stepped outside, the afternoon air felt cooler than it should have for that time of year, brushing against my skin like a reminder that something had changed. I got into my car, placed my hands on the steering wheel, and sat there for a moment without starting the engine. I didn't cry. I didn't feel angry, not in the way people expect. What I felt was clarity, a quiet, steady understanding that settled into my chest like a weight that wasn't going anywhere. After a few seconds, I reached into the passenger seat, picked up the gift box again, and placed it gently in the back. Then I started the car and drove home, already knowing that whatever came next, I would handle it differently than they expected. I woke up the next morning at exactly 6:30, the same way I had for the past 30 years, even though there was no longer any reason to rush through the day. The house was quiet, the kind of quiet that settles into the walls and stays there. I moved through my usual routine without thinking, filling the kettle with water, setting it on the stove, reaching for the same ceramic mug I had used for years. The one Daniel had given me when he was 12, with a crooked hand painted heart and the words "Best Mom" slightly smudged along the side. I ran my thumb over the faded paint as I waited for the water to heat, listening to the soft hum of the kitchen. Everything looked the same. The curtains were still tied back neatly. The small clock above the sink still ticked steadily. But something about the space felt different, as if a layer had been peeled away and what remained was colder, more honest. I poured the hot water, dipped the tea bag, and carried the mug to the table. There was only one place setting now. There had been just one for a long time, but that morning I noticed it in a way I had not before. I sat down and stared at the empty chair across from me, remembering how Daniel used to sit there, legs swinging because they could not yet reach the floor, talking about his day in long, excited sentences that never seemed to end. I had built my life around those moments. Around him. Around making sure he never felt alone, never felt unsupported. I had worked extra shifts when he needed new school supplies. I had skipped vacations so he could go on field trips. When he decided to move into the city after college, I helped with the security deposit on his first apartment without hesitation. Later, when Vanessa came into his life, I told myself that things would change, that they should change. That was how families grew. That was how love expanded. I never questioned the monthly transfers I sent after they moved into their new place together. Rent in their area was high, and Daniel had said they just needed a little help getting started. A little help had turned into a routine. $1,500 on the first of every month, like clockwork. I never asked how it was spent. I never asked why it was still needed after all this time. I told myself that supporting my son meant trusting him. That morning, I took a slow sip of my tea and let the warmth settle in my chest. Only special people. The words returned, quieter now, but sharper, like they had found their place. I set the mug down carefully and looked around the kitchen again, really looking this time. Every corner of this house held a memory of sacrifice, of choices made for someone else's future. I realized then that I had never actually been asked if I wanted to keep giving. It had simply become expected, assumed, like my presence had once been. I finished my tea in silence, rinsed the cup, and placed it back on the shelf. Then I walked into the small office at the end of the hallway, sat down at my desk, and turned on the computer. The screen glowed softly in the dim light as I opened my bank account, familiar numbers appearing in neat rows. My cursor hovered for a moment over the scheduled transfer, the one set to go out in a few days. I did not rush. I did not hesitate either. I simply clicked, removed the payment, and saved the changes. No message, no explanation, just a quiet adjustment, as simple and final as closing a door. Then I leaned back in my chair and folded my hands in my lap, feeling that same steady clarity settle over me again, stronger this time, as if I had finally stepped into a truth that had been waiting for me all along. The first of the month came and went without ceremony, just another square on the calendar turning over quietly as if nothing had changed, and for the first time in years I did not mark the date with a reminder or a task that needed to be done. I woke up that morning with the same calm that had settled over me days before, a kind of stillness that made everything feel sharper, more defined. I made my coffee, sat by the window, and watched the street come to life in slow, ordinary ways. A neighbor walked his dog. A delivery truck paused at the corner. Life moved forward without asking questions, and I found comfort in that. Around 10 o'clock, I heard my phone buzz on the kitchen counter. I did not rush to answer it. I let it ring once, then twice, then stop. A few seconds later, it buzzed again, more insistent this time. I glanced at the screen and saw Daniel's name. For a moment, I simply looked at it, noticing how strange it felt to see his name there without the immediate instinct to pick up. I reached for the phone on the third call and answered, bringing it slowly to my ear. Mom. His voice carried a tightness I had not heard before. Something just beneath the surface that sounded unfamiliar. Good morning, I replied, my tone even, almost gentle. There was a pause on the other end, as if he had expected something different, something more urgent or emotional. Hey, I just want to check in, he said, but the words felt rehearsed, like they were not the real reason he had called. I waited, letting the silence stretch just long enough for him to continue. Did you send the transfer this month? There it was, simple and direct, the question arriving exactly when I knew it would. I leaned back slightly against the counter, looking out the window again as I held the phone. No, I said, just one word. Calm. Clear. Another pause followed, longer this time. I could almost hear his thoughts shifting, trying to make sense of something that no longer fit into the pattern he was used to. No, he repeated, his voice rising slightly at the end, confusion slipping through. Yeah, I mean, rent is due today. Vanessa thought maybe there was a delay or something. I let my gaze rest on the quiet street outside, noticing how the sunlight hit the pavement in soft, steady lines. There was no delay. I answered. My voice did not change. I did not send it. He exhaled sharply, a sound that carried more tension now. Mom, we kind of rely on that. You know that. It's just temporary until things stabilize. Temporary. I had heard that word before, so many times it had lost its meaning. I closed my eyes for a brief moment, not out of frustration, but to steady the clarity that had already taken root. Daniel, I said, his name soft but firm. When was the last time you asked me if I was comfortable continuing that arrangement? The line went quiet again, and this time the silence felt different, heavier, as if something unspoken had finally been placed between us where it could no longer be ignored. I thought it was understood, he said after a moment, his voice lower now, less certain. I nodded slightly, even though he could not see me. Yes, I replied, it was understood. That is exactly the problem. I ended the call not with anger, not with finality, but with the same quiet certainty that had guided me all week, placing the phone back on the counter as if it were just another object in the room. Something ordinary, something that no longer held power over me. The rest of that day passed without interruption, but not without thought. I moved through my house slowly, noticing things I had not paid attention to in years. The faint scratch on the dining table from when Daniel was 8 and insisted on building a model airplane indoors. The small crack in the hallway wall that I had meant to fix, but never quite got around to. The framed photographs that lined the staircase, each one capturing a version of a life I had believed was shared. I stopped halfway up and picked up one of the frames, running my fingers along the edge. Daniel was smiling in that picture, his arm wrapped around me after his college graduation, his face full of pride and something softer, something that looked like gratitude. I held that image for a moment longer than necessary, then set it back down exactly where it had been. It was not that those moments were not real. They were, but they belonged to a different time, a different understanding of what we meant to each other. Later that afternoon, my phone buzzed again. This time, I did not need to look at the screen to know who it was. I let it ring once before answering. "Hello, Vanessa," I said, my voice steady. There was no greeting on her end, no attempt at politeness. Just urgency, sharp and immediate. "I do not understand what is going on," she said, her tone tight, controlled in a way that suggested she was trying very hard not to lose it. "The rent is overdue. They have already sent a notice. Daniel said you did not transfer the money. That has to be a mistake." I walked into the living room and sat down, folding one leg over the other, the movement slow and deliberate. "There is no mistake," I replied. The silence that followed was brief, but heavy, like the moment before something shifts completely. "Excuse me," she said, her voice rising slightly, disbelief edging into irritation. "We have bills, responsibilities. This is not something you can just decide to stop without telling us." I glanced around the room, taking in the quiet order of everything, the calm that had replaced something I had not even realized was tension before. "Actually," I said, "it is exactly something I can decide." Her breath caught on the other end, a small, sharp sound. "Margaret, that is not how this works," she said. And for the first time, she used my name not with familiarity, but with a kind of forced authority that felt out of place. "We are family." I let those words settle between us for a moment. Family. I had believed in that word. My entire life. I had built everything around it. "Are we?" I asked quietly. There was a pause, longer this time, and I could almost picture her expression, the slight narrowing of her eyes, the quick calculation behind them. "Of course we are," she said, "but there is less certainty now, less control." "Then help me understand something." I continued, my tone unchanged. "When you decided to get married, when you chose it was important enough to be there, where exactly did I fit into that definition?" She did not answer right away. I could hear faint movement in the background, the rustle of something, maybe her pacing. "That was different," she said finally, the words coming out quicker now, defensive. "It was a small ceremony. We did not want unnecessary complications." Unnecessary. The word landed softly, but it did not miss its mark. I nodded once, even though she could not see it. "I see," I said, and for the first time since the call began, I allowed a small pause to stretch just a second longer than comfortable. "Then I suppose this is also a matter of simplifying things." The line went completely still, as if even the air on her end had stopped moving. I did not raise my voice. I did not explain further. I simply held the silence, knowing that for once, I was not the one being asked to adjust, to accommodate, to make things easier for someone else. When I ended the call, I placed the phone down beside me and leaned back against the couch, my gaze drifting toward the window where the late afternoon light had begun to fade. There was no rush of emotion, no sudden regret, just a quiet, steady sense that something had finally been set in its proper place, even if it had taken me years to get there. That evening, I did something I had not done in a very long time. I sat down at the dining table without any distractions, no television in the background, no phone within reach, just the quiet in my own thoughts. The house felt different now, not empty, but settled, as if it had been waiting for me to notice it again. I folded my hands in front of me and let my gaze rest on the surface of the table, remembering all the dinners that had taken place. There, the birthdays, the holidays, the small, everyday meals that once felt like the center of everything. I used to believe that keeping those traditions alive was enough to keep a family close. That if I gave enough, showed up enough, supported enough, then the connection would remain strong on its own. But somewhere along the way, that balance had shifted quietly and without announcement. I thought back to the first time Daniel had asked for help with rent. He had stood in this very room, his voice careful, almost hesitant, explaining how expensive things were, how they just needed a little support to get settled. I had not even let him finish before I agreed. I remember telling him, "Of course. That is what family is for." And I had meant it. I had believed it completely. What I did not realize then was how easily a temporary arrangement could become an expectation, and how quickly appreciation could turn into assumption. I stood up and walked into the hallway, stopping again at the staircase where the photographs were displayed. This time, I did not pick one up. I simply looked at them from where I stood, seeing them not as moments frozen in time, but as pieces of a story that had continued to change long after those pictures were taken. My phone buzzed again somewhere behind me, the sound echoing faintly through the house. I did not turn back immediately. I already knew the pattern now. First Daniel, then Vanessa, then Daniel again. The rhythm of urgency, of need, of expectation pressing in from the outside. I let it ring until it stopped, then began again, more persistent this time. When I finally walked back into the living room and glanced at the screen, I saw multiple missed calls and a short message waiting beneath them. "We need to talk. This is serious." I read it once, then set the phone back down without replying. Serious. The word lingered in my mind, and I found myself wondering when my feelings had last been considered serious enough to matter. When being excluded from something as significant as my own son's wedding had been treated as something minor, something easily dismissed, something I was simply expected to accept without question. I moved toward the window and looked out into the fading light, watching as the sky shifted into softer shades of gray and blue. There was a time when I would have responded immediately, when I would have called back, apologized for any inconvenience, tried to fix whatever problem had arisen, even if it meant setting aside my own discomfort to do it. That had been my role for so long that it had begun to feel like my responsibility. But standing there, in the quiet of my own home, I realized that responsibility had never truly been shared. It had only ever flowed in one direction. I turned away from the window and walked back to the table, pulling out a chair and sitting down slowly. I reached for a small notepad I kept nearby and a pen, something simple, something ordinary. For a moment, I just held it considering. Then I began to write, not a message to them, not an explanation or an apology, but a list. A list of every time I had said yes without being asked if I wanted to. Every time I had given without being acknowledged. Every time I had made space for them while quietly stepping out of it myself. The words came steadily, line after line, not rushed, not emotional, just clear. When I finished, I placed the pen down beside the paper and looked at what I had written. It was not anger that I felt as I read it. It was understanding, the kind that does not demand a reaction, only a decision. I folded the paper neatly and set it aside, knowing I did not need to show it to anyone else. It was enough that I had finally seen it for myself. Somewhere in the house, my phone buzzed again, insistent, repeating the same urgency that no longer reached me in the same way. I remained where I was, hands resting calmly on the table, letting the sound fade into the background, just another noise that no longer required my attention. The next morning arrived with a quiet certainty that felt almost unfamiliar, not because it was new, but because I had ignored it for so long. I opened the curtains and let the light fill the room, watching as it spread slowly across the floor, touching the furniture, the walls, the small details I had once arranged with care and then forgotten to appreciate. There was a calm in the air, not the kind that comes from everything being perfect, but the kind that comes from finally understanding where you stand. I made breakfast without rushing, a simple plate of toast and eggs, and sat down at the table, taking my time with each bite. For years, my mornings have been shaped around other people's needs, other people's schedules, other people's expectations. That morning, there was only mine. Around mid-morning, there was a knock at the door. Not loud, not aggressive, but firm enough to carry intention. I set my cup down and walked to the front of the house, already knowing who it would be before I even reached for the handle. When I opened the door, Daniel stood there, his shoulders slightly tense, his expression caught somewhere between concern and something else I could not quite place. Vanessa stood a step behind him, her arms crossed lightly, her posture composed but rigid. Neither of them smiled. "Mom," Daniel said, his voice softer than it had been on the phone, as if being here in person required a different tone. I stepped aside without a word and let them in. The house seemed to shift slightly with their presence, as if it was adjusting to something it had not felt in a while. They moved into the living room and remained standing for a moment before sitting down, close together, their bodies angled toward each other in a way that made it clear they were arriving as a unit. I took the chair across from them, leaving enough space between us for the silence to settle comfortably. "We tried calling you," Vanessa said, her voice controlled, each word measured. "We thought something might be wrong." I folded my hands in my lap, meeting her gaze without tension. "Nothing is wrong," I replied. Daniel leaned forward slightly, resting his elbows on his knees. "Then why are you acting like this?" he asked, the confusion in his voice more open now, less guarded. I considered his question for a moment, not because I did not have an answer, but because I wanted to choose it carefully. "I'm not acting like anything," I said. "I'm simply no longer continuing something that was never discussed properly." Vanessa let out a small breath, her composure tightening. "You mean the rent," she said quickly, as if naming it would bring the conversation back under her control. "We already talked about this. You have been helping us for years. You cannot just stop without warning." I tilted my head slightly, not in disagreement, but in quiet acknowledgment of her perspective. "And you could plan a wedding without telling me," I said calmly. The words landed softly, but they did not lose their weight. Daniel shifted in his seat, his gaze dropping briefly before returning to mine. It was not meant to hurt you," he said, though his voice carried less certainty than before. I watched him for a moment, seeing not just the man sitting in front of me, but the boy he used to be, layered beneath years of choices and influences that had slowly changed the way he saw the world. "Intent does not change impact," I replied, my tone steady, not accusing, just clear. Vanessa straightened slightly, her expression sharpening. "This is not the same thing," she said. "One is personal, the other is financial. You are mixing two completely different issues." I held her gaze, unshaken. "They're not different," I said. "They're connected. Both are about value, about where I stand in your lives." The room fell quiet again, the kind of silence that does not ask to be filled. I did not raise my voice. I did not defend myself further. I simply sat there, present and certain, no longer adjusting my position to make the conversation easier for them. For the first time in a long time, I was not trying to hold everything together. I was simply letting things be seen for what they were. Daniel shifted again, this time leaning back as if the weight of the conversation had finally settled on him in a way he could not ignore. His hands rested on his knees, fingers loosely interlocked, but there was tension in the way they held together, like he was trying to keep something from slipping out. Vanessa, on the other hand, sat straighter, her posture more rigid now, her expression carefully controlled but no longer as smooth as before. "So what exactly are you saying?" she asked, her voice measured but edged with impatience. "That you are cutting us off because of one decision?" I did not answer immediately. I let the question sit between us, not because I needed time to think, but because I wanted it to be heard fully, without interruption, without being softened or redirected. It was not one decision, I said finally. It was a pattern. Daniel looked up at that, his brow tightening slightly. What pattern? He asked, his tone quieter now, less defensive, more uncertain. I held his gaze, steady and calm. The pattern where I am expected to give, but not included. The pattern where my support is assumed, but my presence is optional. The words were simple, but they did not waver. Vanessa let out a small breath, a sound that carried more frustration than before. You are taking this too personally, she said. We made a choice about our wedding. That is normal. Plenty of couples do small ceremonies. I nodded once. And plenty of people choose how to spend their money, I replied. That is also normal. The silence that followed was sharper now, more defined. Daniel ran a hand through his hair, a gesture I recognized from years ago when he was trying to solve a problem he did not fully understand. Mom, he said slowly, we are not trying to exclude you. Things have just been different. Different. I let that word settle for a moment, then allowed myself a small, almost imperceptible smile. Yes, I said. They have. Vanessa leaned forward slightly, her voice tightening again. We cannot just fix everything overnight. You are expecting too much if you think one event defines everything. I looked at her, really looked this time, not with judgment, but with clarity. I'm not asking you to fix anything, I said. I'm adjusting my part in it. That seemed to catch her off guard, if only for a second. She blinked, her composure slipping just enough to reveal the uncertainty underneath. Daniel exhaled slowly, his shoulders dropping slightly, as if something inside him had shifted. So what does that mean? He asked. What happens now? I leaned back in my chair, my hands resting calmly in my lap. It means I stop doing what I have been doing, I said, and you start doing what you need to do. Vanessa shook her head lightly, disbelief creeping in again. That is not realistic, she said. We have commitments. We have responsibilities. I did not argue. I did not raise my voice. So do I replied. I always have. The room grew quiet again, but this time the silence felt different, less like tension and more like realization slowly taking shape. Daniel looked down at his hands, then back up at me, his expression softer now, more conflicted. You really are not going to help us anymore? He asked, and there was something in his voice now that had not been there before. Not just frustration, but the beginning of understanding. I met his eyes, steady and calm. I'm not going to continue something that only works one way, I said. I did not need to say more. The words settled into the space between us, clear and complete. For the first time since they had walked through the door, neither of them had an immediate response. And in that silence, something shifted again, not loudly, not dramatically, but enough to change the direction of everything that would come next. Vanessa was the first to break the silence, but this time her voice had lost some of its sharpness, replaced by something more controlled, more cautious. So that is it? She asked. You were just stepping back and leaving us to figure everything out on our own? I did not answer right away. I let her question linger, not because I needed to think, but because I wanted her to hear what she had just said. Leaving us, as if I had ever truly been standing beside them in the way she implied. You are not on your own, I said finally, my tone even. You are together. That is what you chose. Daniel shifted slightly at that, his gaze dropping for a moment before returning to me. There was something different in his expression now, something quieter, less certain of where he stood. That is not what she means, he said, but his voice lacked the confidence it once carried. Vanessa glanced at him briefly, then back at me. We built our life with the understanding that we had support, she said. You were part of that plan. I nodded slowly, acknowledging the truth in her words without agreeing with the conclusion. And I built my life with the understanding that I was part of yours, I replied. The room grew still again, but this time it was not tense. It was reflective, like something was finally being seen clearly from both sides, even if neither of them was ready to say it out loud. Daniel leaned forward again, his elbows resting on his knees, his hands loosely clasped. I did not realize it felt like that for you, he said, and there was no defensiveness in his voice now, only a quiet honesty that had been missing before. I studied his face for a moment, noticing the small changes, the lines that had formed over time, the weight of decisions that had shaped him into the man sitting in front of me. "That is part of the problem," I said gently. Vanessa exhaled slowly, her shoulders dropping just a fraction, as if the conversation had shifted into a place she had not expected. "We cannot go back and change what happened," she said. "The wedding is done. It was our decision." I did not argue with that. There was nothing to argue. "I'm not asking you to change it," I said. "I'm asking you to understand what it meant." She looked at me, really looked this time, and for a brief moment, the certainty in her expression softened, replaced by something more thoughtful, more uncertain. "And this is your way of making a point?" she asked. "By cutting off support?" I shook my head slightly. "No," I said. "This is my way of setting a boundary." The word seemed to land differently, not as an accusation, but as a statement that did not require approval. Daniel let out a slow breath, his shoulders relaxing slightly as if something inside him had finally aligned. "So what happens if we cannot manage right away?" he asked. I held his gaze, steady and calm. "Then you will figure it out," I said, just like I did. There was no harshness in my voice, no judgment, just a quiet certainty that did not leave room for negotiation. Vanessa looked down briefly, her fingers tightening together in her lap, then loosened again. "This is going to be difficult," she said, more to herself than to me. I inclined my head slightly. "Growth usually is," I replied. The silence that followed was not uncomfortable. It was full, settled, as if something that had been unbalanced for a long time had finally found its center. Daniel sat back slowly, his expression thoughtful, no longer resisting, no longer pushing. Vanessa remained quiet, her posture no longer rigid, but not entirely at ease either. I did not rush to fill the space. I did not offer solutions or compromises. I simply remained where I was, present and steady, knowing that for the first time in a long time, I was no longer carrying something that was never meant to be mine alone. Daniel was the one who stood up first, slowly, as if the weight of the conversation had settled into his shoulders and he needed to move just to carry it. Vanessa followed a second later, her movements more controlled, more deliberate, but no longer sharp. Neither of them spoke right away. The room held that quiet balance we had reached, something fragile but real, something that could not be forced or undone with a single sentence. I remained seated for a moment longer, watching them, not with expectation, not with disappointment, just with a calm understanding of who we were now. "We should go," Daniel said finally, his voice softer than it had been when they arrived. I nodded once and stood, smoothing my hands lightly against the fabric of my skirt, a small, familiar gesture that grounded me in the moment. I walked them to the door, each step steady, unhurried. Vanessa reached for her bag, pausing briefly as if she wanted to say something, but whatever thought crossed her mind did not make it into words. Daniel opened the door and stepped outside, then turned back to look at me, his expression thoughtful, searching in a way I had not seen in a long time. "Mom," he said, and for a moment that was all. Just a word. It carried more than anything else he could have added. I met his eyes, holding that moment without trying to shape it into something it was not. "Take care of yourself," I said, my voice steady, not distant but no longer reaching either. He nodded slowly, as if he understood more than he could explain, then stepped away. Vanessa followed, her posture quieter now, less certain than when she had first walked in. The door closed gently behind them, not with finality, but with a sense of completion. I stood there for a few seconds, my hand resting lightly on the handle, feeling the stillness settle back into the house. It did not feel empty. It felt clear. I turned and walked back into the living room, the same space that had held so much tension earlier, now calm and undisturbed. The late afternoon. Light had shifted again, softer now, stretching across the floor in long, quiet lines. I sat down on the couch and let myself rest there, not thinking about what they would do next, not wondering how things would unfold. For the first time in a long time, I was not trying to anticipate or manage anything beyond my own space. My phone remained where I had left it, silent now, no longer pulling my attention in the same way. I did not reach for it. I did not need to. Instead, I leaned back and closed my eyes for a brief moment, allowing the quiet to settle fully around me. This was not about winning or losing. It was not about proving a point or making someone feel the weight of what had happened. It was about balance, about recognizing where I stood and choosing not to step out of that place anymore. After a while, I stood and walked into the kitchen, moving through the familiar motions of preparing dinner, simple and unhurried. The rhythm of it felt different now, not tied to expectation, not shaped by anyone else's schedule, just mine. As I set the table, I placed a single plate in front of the chair, the same way I had that morning, but this time it did not feel like something missing. It felt complete. I sat down and looked around the room, taking in the quiet, the order, the life I had built and maintained for so many years. Nothing had been taken from me. Not really. I had simply stopped giving it away without being seen. I picked up my fork and began to eat, the simple act grounding me in a way that felt steady and certain. Outside, the evening settled in, calm and unremarkable, just another day ending. But inside, something had shifted into place, something that would not move again. And for the first time in a long time, that was enough.